Hello and welcome to the lecture on use case of an user class. So let's say you have to define a user class. So let's take an example of what are the concepts that we have learned, like what is class, what is object, what is property, and what is method, and how to start thinking in objects and organizing in classes. Let's implement all together and look at a use case, how you can implement those concepts. Okay, for this let me create a folder called use case for class, and we'll create a file here which is called as users.php. We'll open that in Sublime, and we'll start creating that class. Call it as users, and I'll define two methods in it. One is to fetch users, where you pass the ID, and another method maybe to delete that user. Okay, you can have any operations that you want, but it depends on you what you want to implement. So you pass the ID in it. Okay, and how you're gonna call the methods, right? You're gonna create the objects. So you can say user1 new users, open and close parenthesis. Now using this object you can actually call the method, right? You'll say fetch user. Now you can fetch like you're fetching from a database, right? And you don't have to really do anything fancy here, just recall the method n number of times. Maybe you want to delete the user, right? And how you're going to write this functionality is up to you, right? If you know how to connect to a database using PDO and then how to do that operation, you can think as two-step process. The user doesn't directly connect to a database because that is not the job of the users. The job of connecting to a database will be from a database class. Okay, the job of the user is to handle that user request, but the job of a database is to connect to a database. So if you're writing a user class, maybe you're trying to query, maybe you're trying to create an instance of a database. You can say $db is equal to new database, and then you might be calling its method to say, select query, and then maybe you can pass the ID into it, and maybe you're going to pass the table name into it. Well, this database query is specific to that database, right? You can say, okay, this is my ID and this is my database, do this operation. Okay, you leave it to database to do that job. You don't do it in the users. You leave it that specific operation to database to do it. So database will have the code to make a query on that specific table and with specific ID. Okay, but from your user point of view, you need to fetch users, right? But you leave that job to a database to do that. This is how basically OOPs work. You think in components. User component does one operation of fetching the user, but it doesn't do the job of connecting to the database. Connecting to the database is the job of a database component or a database class, right? So you call that database class inside your users and you try to use it. We haven't learned how to access one class inside another class. That's a concept of inheritance, but I'm just giving you an idea of if you want to do an operation of user class, right? You can define methods that is specific to that users. You can define objects to call that operations, and then you can have different components doing different jobs, and then you can reuse them into your own components. This is your logical step, right? You will call the database, okay, query the database, okay, that's your first step. Then you will display the records. How you're gonna do it is up to you. Okay, and maybe you have a variable called result which is always false, and maybe after this the result will become true, and then you're returning that result. Okay, so as and when we go into this course, we will be implementing this code, right? We will try to understand how the relationship between two classes work. When you understand that concept of inheritance, then we'll implement and enhance this code for users to go connect to a database, and database will go actually connect to the physical database and fetch the records, pass it back to the users. Okay, but for now, logically understand how these things work and how you can write your program into classes. That's the main purpose of understanding this code. And you can still say echo deleting the records. So we're not doing the implementation here, we are trying to understand the oops concept here. We're doing a use case of a users class. Okay, so users class basically can have two methods, fetch users and delete users, and by just creating instance of it and passing that ID, you can actually write a method to do that specific operations. You can say query the database for ID. Okay, so you can see you can query the database and then you can delete the records. So now you have a way to organize your code. That's the most important thing I want you to start thinking, right? You have a way to organize your program now. Okay, if you're thinking about user class, this is how you organize your program, and this is how you basically write methods and call them. Okay, so that's an example and a use case of how do you write a users class. We'll do the implementation of these classes in the upcoming lectures where we understand more concepts of oops. Okay, so that's all for this lecture of how to do a use case of user class, and I'll see you in the next one.